Number 1. I was visiting a friend in a town I visit fairly often, and he had to go to work. Since he was working a split shift, I elected to go into town with him so we could have lunch together. We get into town, and he heads off to work, and I go in search of a Frappuccino. I could have just gone to Starbucks, yes, but I wanted to try the local coffee shops. Eventually, I find one, I get a coffee, and sit and enjoy myself for a while. I notice a guy looking at me, but I don't really think anything of it, and I assume it was him just looking in my direction. I leave, go get lunch with my friend, and wander around for a bit. I end up going back to the same coffee shop since they were literally the only place that served Frappuccinos. I really like Frappuccinos. I get in the shop, and the same guy was still there, in the same spot. I didn't think anything of it since only a couple of hours had passed. While I ordered my drink, though, I noticed him looking at me again, but looking for sure at me this time. When I sat down, I immediately put my headphones in so he wouldn't try to talk to me, but didn't put on music since I was starting to feel creeped out and wanted to be alert. After a few minutes, he says to me in a very thick Russian accent,
"Oh, I see you came back for me."
I obviously ignore him and pretend I can't hear him. He repeats himself, only louder, and I again ignore him. He then says,
"I am talking to you. I see you are here again."
At this point, a woman jumps in and says, "She obviously can't hear you. She has headphones in." As the coffee shop is getting ready to close, I notice he is taking a long time to leave, as if he is planning on following me, so I stick around until after he has left. I go outside and realized he had waited for me. As soon as I realized this, I ducked into a bookshop to browse for a bit, and he followed me through the bookshop. I was starting to feel seriously creeped out when I got a text from my friend telling me to meet him where he worked for a drink. At this point, it is totally dark, about 10 p.m. I leave the bookshop and walk towards my friend's place of work, which is hidden down an alley. Thankfully, there were people outside the place, so I was able to duck in without him following. He was gone by the time my friend and I left. In hindsight, I should have told someone I was being followed, but I was worried I was making a mountain out of a molehill, and I figured I could just wait in the bookstore for my friend to get off and come get me.
Number 2.
This happened about 3 years ago. I have worked at a state-run mental institute for about 5 or 6 years now. All the patients who come here are court-ordered. We don't do self-admittance here. So we get most of the local high-profile criminals who are either mentally ill or need to be screened because they are claiming they are. The institution houses around 350 to 400 patients, so after you've worked here for a few years, it's pretty common to bump into someone who has been released, especially being a smaller town. Normally it's pretty chill, a simple wave from a distance or a quick "how are you?" As employees, we can't legally approach them in public, but they can approach us. On the complex, we have 4 buildings: a woman's facility, a sex offender facility, men's short-term care, and maximum security, reserved for violent patients and murderers. 3 years ago, I decided to move. I found this great big house. The rent was cheap, it was fully updated, and had so much charm and character, but the neighborhood was kind of iffy. My husband, at the time, we've since separated, would always sit and smoke out on the porch. For a few weeks, I would randomly see or hear him talking to someone, a man. He looked kind of dirty, like he didn't change clothes much or had a dirty job. I just assumed he was a neighbor. Didn't think anything of it. One evening, I went outside to call my husband in for dinner after putting our 1-year-old son down to sleep, and the man freaked out when he saw me.
I know you. You remember me?
No, I'm sorry. Who are you?
Nah, you remember me. Nobody forgets his face. You're you worked at the Institute.
Yeah, I work there. Were you an employee or a resident? At this point, he gets angry, started screaming at me for not remembering his name, and goes into a full psychotic episode. He was rambling and screaming about the demons that still talk to him, but as long as he drinks, they only whisper. How the squirrels are watching out for him for danger. They are his friends and don't want him to get into trouble because they don't want him to go back, and now he's never going back to the Institute. Suddenly, he starts yelling at the squirrels to be quiet, that he's talking. Then focused in on me, talking about how I'm here to take him back. But he's never going back. Starts screaming more. I get my husband inside, try to de-escalate the situation, but he wasn't having it. He was convinced now that I was sent by the Institute to bring him back. I locked my door and instantly called my coworker for advice. He looked the guy up, and he had been a resident in max security, but was non-violent for the majority of his stay. A week or two goes by, no sign of him, but I find traces of him randomly. Some paper with gibberish written on it, drawings, sticks arranged in a weird design on my porch. I would randomly get that being watched feeling when doing yard work, which being in my line of work is an intuition you rely on, and would promptly go inside. It all finally came to a head when I saw a shadowy figure across the street watching my house. I decided enough and called the police, the Institute, to find his caseworker's phone number and my supervisor. He was gone before the police came, but after some time, his caseworker tracked him down and informed me he had been spoken to and to call again if he's seen. I've moved since then, but that man is still out there somewhere, probably still unmedicated and not receiving the proper help he needs, because let's be real, the government sucks at follow-up care for the extremely poor and homeless. He is a ticking time bomb, and the scariest thing for me is waiting to see his name on the new admit register and waiting to see the reason for his return, knowing whatever it is could have been me.
Number 3.
I was teaching English in a Southeast Asian country a few years ago. I'm an Australian girl and was in my early 20s at the time. It was a pretty lonely time. The classes I taught were night classes for young adults, and my fellow teachers were quite cliquey, and I had yet to break into their inner circle. I had made friends, but not many close friends. It's worth noting that I had a mobile phone, but no SIM card. My only means of communication were to latch onto Wi-Fi at bars, cafes, work, my apartment. Anyway, the following happened on my day off, when I was alone. I had caught the bus into town. I lived in a shared apartment about 40 minutes from the city center to suss out the local museums and maybe see a movie. After 2 museums, multiple stops at air-conditioned bars for countless units of cigarettes and beer, I decided the afternoon was getting on. I was stinking hot and tired, so maybe I should head home. The sun was still out, but setting. It was about 4 p.m. and still quite light. I wasn't too familiar with the layout of the city and the bus route at this stage, but using my elementary navigational skills, I worked out a vague direction that I needed to walk to get to my bus stop. I was enjoying my slightly buzzed walk, following small back lanes closer and closer to this bus stop I had been on the hunt for. I was keen to get home, so I wasn't really paying attention to anything except following the setting sun, so I would be heading west. I remember walking past a small shop front with a man sitting out the front. The man was thin, in his 30s. There was a child, maybe 6 or 7, sitting next to him. At the time, I thought it was sweet, father and son boutique shop type of thing. I gave them both a small, awkward smile as I walked past. I barely lifted my head. The little boy looked at me strangely. Suddenly, the man's eyes lit up like crazy. I remember seeing him in my peripheral vision spring up from the gutter. He was crouching there with great enthusiasm. He didn't say a word or make a sound. He just stood up very quickly as I finished walking by. I think he took my small, awkward smile directed at the little boy as some kind of eerie invitation. I started feeling scared, and I'm admittedly not very street savvy, so I guarantee my anxious mannerisms were obvious. I quickened my pace, pulled my bag closer to my stomach, and put my head down. I pretended to slow down to fix my sandal, but really I was trying to throw a quick look behind me to see what was going on. The man had quickened his pace in the last 10 or so meters of following me. He was closing in. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't trying to get my attention. He was just following me in a completely empty back street, still smiling enthusiastically. At this point, I was walking on the right-hand side of the road, my head swimming with paranoid thoughts. I tried to calm down and test out what was going on. I simply crossed the road to see if he would follow. I didn't check for motorbikes. This is Southeast Asia, remember. Cars are few and far between. It dawned on me that a motorbike going by would actually be quite a good thing, even if it did hit me. What did hit me suddenly was the thought that we were very, very much alone in this street. Sure enough, as I crossed, he quickly followed my path onto the other side of the street. My heart sank into my stomach. I had no idea how much longer this alley went on for. Nobody was walking by. I didn't even really know what part of the city we were in. I couldn't speak the language very well. I hadn't told anybody where I was going. I remember sending my boyfriend a text that morning saying I was not to be contacted for the day. We had fought the night before. Long distance sucks. In this country, Western women were usually subject to an element of creepiness. I knew that. But this felt different. Everything suddenly felt really wrong. Inherently wrong. I panicked more and went to pull out my phone to pretend to make a phone call. I thought this might stop him. I was moving at a very fast walk, nearly jog at this point. He was picking up his pace gradually, and the gap between us was now less than a few meters. To grab my phone, I had to rummage around through all the mess in my handbag, which had slowed me down. I felt his presence closer behind me. I thought, never mind the phone, and broke into a sprint. He started sprinting too. I remember making a noise, not quite a scream, more of a whelp. I shouted, "Stop now," in English, then "No," and "Go, leave," in the native tongue of the country I was in. I didn't turn around. My bag was smacking my thigh. My feet were pounding the concrete. My heart was racing. He was still behind me. I decided to make a bold move, which I'm glad I did. I saw another alleyway opening up to the left. It looked larger. I could see windows facing onto it. Here we go, I thought. I just need other people to be around. This will be fine. I turned down into the alleyway, still shouting, "No," in his language. I couldn't see any faces in the windows. There were bikes out the front of people's houses, so it was likely there were people around. I kept sprinting. Then I got super lucky. After a few bends in this alley, I saw a huge intersection on the other side. I'm talking 8 or so lanes of traffic all over each other. This man was still pursuing me. I refused to look him in the eye, but he was fearless. He could hear me shout, and that didn't stop him. I finally thought, "Ha!" when I saw the intersection. It was finally over. Thank goodness. I exited the alley and saw the sweet comfort of buzzing motorcycles and other people's faces in front of me. I had no idea where I was in relation to the bus stop. I immediately decided I was avoiding public transport today, so I looked for a taxi. I know there were some legitimate private taxi companies and some dodgy ones by this stage. I waited until I saw a trusted brand parked on the other side of the intersection. I was fine. This was fine. The man had stopped where he'd seen me move into the business of the road. I glanced over my shoulder, and he stood there, waving at me from the exit point of the alley and the intersection. Just waving, casually. I recoiled in disgust, crossed my arms over my chest, something I do to relieve a bit of anxiety, and kept walking at a steady pace toward the cab. I hop in the cab and make my best attempt at speaking the local language, telling the driver my address and basic directions on how to get there. The driver had trouble understanding me. Can you blame him? The Australian accent is bloody terrible. So I pulled out my notebook and wrote the address down for him. Unfortunately, my writing was quite difficult for him to read too, so I slowed down and tried to explain it more clearly. I wasn't really paying attention to anything going on, except helping the driver understand where I wanted to go. I heard the back door of the cab slam. The driver and I swung around. There he was. He had gotten into the cab with me. I was in shock. I sputtered. The nerve of this guy. He started barking instructions at the driver, who was clearly confused. My basic understanding of what he said was that he was going with me, he was my boyfriend, and to take us away from the city. I'm guessing my stalker had assumed I didn't understand any of his language, but I did, and that message worried me. I was alone in a car with two strange men in a foreign country, and one had the explicit intent of kidnapping me. What kind of ridiculous position is that to be in? So I did what any insane, terrified person would do. I screamed. In no language that made any sense. I did everything I could to convey to this driver that I was unsafe. I made strange wailing noises and basically said no over and over again. The driver looked at both of us, confused out of his mind, waiting for the prank cameras, I'm guessing. After about a minute of me screaming at the driver and my stalker, who had begun to touch my hair from the back seat, despite me swatting him away multiple times, the driver got the idea and said something very threatening in their language. The driver turned the keys, walked around to the stalker in the back seat, and verbally abused him, waving his keys in his face. The stalker put on this "what can I do, face, smug little dickworm. He finally got out of the car and tried to tug on my hair as he got out. The driver took me to my apartment, where in his language I brokenly tried to explain what had happened. Turned out this lovely gentleman did speak a little English, so I tried to give him the full story as best I could. He dropped me home 40 minutes later, tried to refuse a fee, but I stuck 3 times the actual fare in the driver's door as I got out. I'll never be able to thank him properly for picking up on the universal language of distress and handling it with such kindness. Moral of the story: don't give off awkward, scared vibes. It's an invitation that says, I'm probably incapable of defending myself if need be. Also, there's a reason I didn't include the specific country. I actually loved every country in Southeast Asia so much, and this story was pretty much the only negative thing that happened to me. The people there, overall, are kind and warm, and I won't taint the country's reputation because of one weirdo.